Legislators do not want to talk to you unless you're talking about private education, because they feel that that will minimize tax dollars and they can shrink government, and that private schools will then be able to step in. But that's an unrealistic conversation. There are about 300 and some odd private schools in our state. There are well over 1,500 public schools in our state, over 1 million students. I'm not willing to let that generation of students falter while we discuss whether private or public is the right option here for the next few years.
Really, the people being elected are really elected at the primaries. Primaries, you have typically more your radical members of your party voting and putting people in place that they want.
And their constituency then is not the whole district voters, all the voters in their district. That's not their constituency. Their constituency is not the whole state of Arizona. Their constituency is that 10% who voted, in the primary.
When you're polarized like that, our legislators are not working together then for the benefit of all Arizonans. They're working for their small political constituency.
The ideological position that we encounter most often is that government is too large, we spend too much money, it must be smaller. And that's about as far as it goes.
The entity you really need to be focused on is the state legislature, because they control the purse for our schools, and it's their decisions that affect your child's lives more than anybody else's decision.
Arizonans enjoy a very low tax burden.
We've gone from the 8th highest state taxed state in the nation to the 41st.
We've predicated our tax policy based upon a single metric: tax cuts.
Arizonans receive tax cuts in the income tax area, the property tax area, as well as the sales tax area.
There is this notion that the Wild West doesn't need any property tax or the most minimal amount of property tax. Our income taxes have to be low in order to compete.
We've effectively got 2 levels of tax policy. One is whatever you can convince the legislature to do, which is less and less and less and less over the last 10 years. And then there is what the people will decide they want done because the legislature won't do it. So that's how you end up with tax referendums on transportation, on education, on state trust lands. And so what you get is a hodgepodge of tax policy over 2 decades that's driven by polling and popular interest, not by any sort of long-term strategic view of what's essential to creating a tax system in Arizona that will actually sustain the kinds of programs that we believe are important.
But we're too tied to consumer spending currently and construction industry-related revenue, and we've seen that that's produced one of the worst impacts in the United States in terms of Arizona's tax problem.
Individuals are contributing a higher percentage of taxes to education, and the corporate community is contributing a lower percentage. Walmart shifted $230 million out of state taxes. They were able to escape $230 million of taxes nationwide. I think there's probably something wrong with a teacher paying more income tax than a multinational corporation, and I think most people would agree. The policymakers that allow those loopholes to stay on the books are really to blame. The multinational corporations are only doing what they're allowed to do under the law.
Now what they have is a situation where the amount of revenue coming into the state is simply not sufficient.
The vast majority of data suggests that over decades, Arizona has significantly lagged the nation in terms of funding.
We need to increase the amount of revenue that's available to the state for those purposes by about $2 billion.
There is a dialogue that has to take place as to whether we're enforcing the tax laws we have right now, collecting from those companies that do business in the state, but also are we encouraging the kinds of economic activity that will actually provide sustainable finances for the future.
There are a lot of exemptions in a tax code. There are a lot of specific deductions that were given at a point in time that may or may not make sense anymore. It's hard work, but if you can go through a tax code and find those deductions and those exemptions that really don't make sense anymore, sometimes tax policy makers and even political folks will understand that those things don't make sense and they shouldn't be there anymore. Part of the funding challenge is to find areas that are undertaxed so that we don't end up overtaxing populations in states like Arizona or any state, and also not taxing business out of a competitive nature with other states.
Today we have a service economy, and yet a lot of our taxes are based on that older manufacturing economy.
Sales taxes have always been written in terms of durable goods. And so a lot of people are buying services instead of those goods. And if the sales tax base doesn't expand to include those services, then it really isn't going to be worth what it used to be worth.
And we need to bite the bullet.
You really just have to get the tax code back out, dust off the cobwebs, and make sure that it applies to today's dollars.
There needs to be a rebalancing, but it can't happen very, very quickly. It has to be happening over a period of time. We have to take a longer view, otherwise the impact, the shock to the system will create its own problems.
We have some capacity in this state to increase funding.
You've got some major obstacles to climb over, one of which is the 2/3 requirement, the legislative requirement to pass a tax increase.
Education, K through 12, public safety, universities. I believe we need an exemption from the 2/3 vote for those and allow for a majority vote of the legislature to increase taxes that's earmarked for one of those three purposes.
We have to start to realize, just as we do in our households, just as we do in business, that you must have a plan and a way to address the goals and objectives within that plan to get there. And our state has not done that in the last 8 years. It hasn't done it in the last 2 decades before that. It hasn't done it in quite a while.
The Constitution says very explicitly that the legislature shall provide by means of taxation for the development and improvement of all of the state's educational institutions.
People expect it. It's an ingrained part of what we believe is an important role for our governments.
The ballot is no place to decide upon tax increases. We have a representative democracy. People are elected to office to make tough decisions. One of the tough decisions they have to make is to evaluate the needs of the state as to its existing resources and decide whether or not additional resources are needed. That's what they got elected to do.
People ought to be concerned about failure to act from our policymakers' level. And I'm talking over decades, not just certainly in a year or compare this year with 2 years ago. You need to look over decades. You need to look at longer periods of time and simply ask the question, are we meeting the constitutional obligations that are set forth in terms of education?
Legislators are not down there to get reelected. They're down there and they take an oath of office, not to a political party. They take an oath of office to the people of the state of Arizona.
Till the people of the state of Arizona rise up and demand moderates from both parties who will understand their responsibility to compromise and make the system work, we're going to continue to have fights like this.
In order to get more mainstream people elected, all right, we need to reduce the number of what we call non-competitive districts.
Until we do something like that, we can put a lot of proposals on the table, but the legislators are really not going to be real favorable because they don't have to be. They don't have to listen to anybody but their small constituency.